Good evening, ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties. This is Alex, coming at you from the underworld, and welcome back to another episode of... This weekend, I'm reviewing the classic horror collection, The October Country by Ray Bradbury. Now, before I get started, I would just like to note that I had intended to read and review this book last October. However, Hanny and I became deeply invested in the Pine Deep trilogy by Jonathan Mayberry, and by the time we were finished with those books, spooky season was over. So, because of that happening, the October Country moved to the top of this year's October TBR, and before I got started, I gathered up a buddy reading group which consisted of my good online friends Hanny and John, as well as my niece Abby. Also, John decided to bring along a new friend by the name of Amy, which we were happy to have join us. And as always, I'm very grateful to have buddy read this with a group because Bradbury writes with a strong openness, and had I read this alone, I'm afraid I might not would have been exposed to all of the different possibilities that his stories presented.
Connie and I made something for you.
We found a recipe for it in an ancient grimoire.
I don't trust neither one of you bitches. Thanks to what y'all did in that last book review, I'm still sitting on this friggin' donut. I ain't drinking nothing that y'all give me.
You don't have to drink anything this time. All you have to do is close your eyes and make a wish.
No, I don't trust neither one of you bitches. Leave me the hell alone.
He's not cooperating.
Who cares? Do it now!
Powdered turds of cat.
Dried semen of bull.
Ground pecker of crow.
It's smegma mule.
Wait, mules have smegma?
Yeah, male and female mammals create it.
Ew.
But it will be worth it. Did the last one work?
Yes, it was a pain in his ass.
What will this one do?
Hell, I don't know. Shit.
What the hell is wrong with y'all? What kind of a sick pervert does the crap that the two of you do? My God, have I died and gone straight to hell? Well, without wasting anyone else's time with Carrie and Connie's antics, I would just like to stress that I really did enjoy this buddy read with my group, and if any of you are watching, I hope you enjoy this review. But for now, it's time that we start to think autumn thoughts as we explore the October Country. The October Country by Ray Bradbury opens up with a beautiful paragraph description that sets the stage for a gothic world where autumn exists year-round. Then, after we become submersed in an atmosphere full of gray days and dead leaves, we're introduced to 19 tales that range between morbid horror and gothic fantasy. And even though none of these stories are gruesome or explicit, they will certainly drop a few jaws and keep readers talking long after they finish this book. Which, among the stories collected here, we are introduced to murderers, things from beyond the grave, body horror, an evil baby, and the list continues into more chilling territories. Although The October Country by Ray Bradbury was published in 1955, many of its tales were reworkings of stories that appeared in his first book called Dark Carnival, which had gone out of print only a few years after its release. Eventually, the opportunity presented itself for Bradbury to compose a new collection, where this allowed him to correct stories that he felt was previously inadequate. Upon Bradbury using Dark Carnival as his main source, he rewrote quite a few of its stories, and he lightly revised others. Altogether, he cut 12 tales from Dark Carnival, and he added 4 new works to round out the October Country. Bradbury explained that his discarded stories were pieces that he thought were too weak, too violent, or too primitive, and they did not represent where he was as a writer at that time. Fun facts! Here's a few things that I found out about some of my favorite stories in this collection. The Jar was originally published in Weird Tales magazine in 1944. 2 decades later, it was adapted into an episode of the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. Then, in 1992, it appeared on the Ray Bradbury Theater. In the past, it has been noted that this tale, such as the setting in Bradbury's other carnival-based fiction, allowed him a stage to discuss the presence of evil being a threat to the world. And in this circumstance, the jar itself allowed Bradbury to express his belief that every human has the potential of being good or evil. The Small Assassin was first published in the November 1946 issue of Dime Stories. Years later, in 1953, it would be adapted as a tale in the EC comic book Shock Suspense Stories. Then, in 1989, it was adapted as an episode of the Ray Bradbury Theater. In the past, The Small Assassin has been hailed as Bradbury's presentation of the fear of birth. The Scythe is an allegorical tale that was originally published in the 1943 issue of Weird Tales magazine, and it is considered one of Bradbury's earliest attempts at dealing with and ridding humanity of what he called the hairball fears about death. Bradbury has reasoned that once free from such fears, we can devote our energies to positive endeavors. The Emissary was first published in 1947 for Dark Carnival, and in 1988 it became adapted into an episode of the Ray Bradbury Theater. Since its release, it has caused readers to question if the ending is one of horror or happiness. Now that we have that covered, it's time to move on to the spoilers section, which, if you haven't read this book before, I'm about to reveal some things that could ruin the experience for you. So if you would like to click away, just scroll down to the comments and you'll see that I have a pinned comment at the top with the timestamp in it. Once you click on that timestamp, it will direct you away from the spoilers section and bring you to the thoughts segment. Now, you only have 17 seconds to do this. So, ready, set, go! Since everyone's had the opportunity to click away, I would like to talk about a few of my favorite stories. First up is The Emissary, which is about a young boy named Martin who is bedridden. And since he's not able to go anywhere or do anything, the highlight of his day is having his pet dog come to his bedside. Since Martin is lonely, he uses this opportunity to attach notes to Dog's collar out of hopes that this will attract people to come visit him when Dog is roaming about. Eventually, one day, Miss Haight, who is Martin's teacher, follows Dog to Martin's bedside, where she spends her time playing games and chatting with him. However, their friendship is cut short because she dies in a car accident. Then, following that tragedy, Dog disappears. Well, after October passes and winter comes, one evening Martin hears Dog barking in the neighborhood, and as he calls Dog to come home, eventually Dog winds up on their doorstep where someone downstairs opens the door and lets Dog inside. Then, when Dog jumps in Martin's bed, it's alluded to Dog smelling like graveyard dirt. And as we're trying to wrap our mind around exactly what's going on, a mystery guest shows up in Martin's doorway, and because of how this is playing out, this guest might very well be the reanimated corpse of Miss Haight. I'm not gonna lie, this story scared the hell out of me, which is really weird because at first I had a great feeling about the end. And when I mentioned this to my readers group, we ended up having some really good discussions about what possibly could have happened. Like, on one hand, at first I thought that with Dog and Miss Haight coming back from the grave for Martin, they did this because they wanted to spend more time with him and bring joy into his life, and it gave me this really great feeling that friendship never dies. But the more I thought about it, I said to myself, this ending might not be so happy, because if Dog and Miss Haight are zombies, they might be evil and soulless like what we saw in Pet Cemetery. And if this is the case, it means Martin is trapped with them and he is at their mercy. However, John brought something up that I hadn't considered, as he believed Martin's mother might have had factitious syndrome, and she had convinced Martin as well as everyone else that he was ill, when in actuality there was nothing wrong with him. And if this were the case, then she could have possibly been responsible for Miss Haight's death and Dog's disappearance, because they were getting in the way of her having Martin all to herself. So, if this were true, perhaps Miss Haight and Dog had returned to exact their revenge upon her, and then spend out the rest of their time with Martin. Also, Hanny mentioned another interesting possibility, as she saw that Martin perhaps had polio, since this was big in the 1950s, and it caused people to become bedridden. So, if this were the scenario, then perhaps Martin died from having a life-threatening disease, and the story ended with Miss Haight and Dog coming to collect his soul and bring him home with them, such as guiding him into the light. Which, that's a much more peaceful ending than the one that I had imagined, and even though these other options were presented about the outcome being positive, my brain is stuck in the idea that this is nothing but pure nightmare fuel. So, obviously, that says a lot about me. Next up is the story The Small Assassin, which this is about a woman named Alice who had almost died during childbirth. And because of that experience, she becomes convinced that her newborn is trying to murder her. Well, before she's released from the hospital, her doctor explains to her husband David that she's under a lot of stress and she's not really adapting to being a mother. So because of that, David really needs to give her a lot of support over the next year. From there, after David brings Alice home, he sees that she's really standoffish with the baby, and she's convinced that the baby can do all of these things that are well beyond its years, which, of course, David just writes this off as her being stressed out. However, as everything starts to snowball, he discovers that his wife is right because the baby starts to terrorize him. However, before it's too late, the baby ends up killing Alice by tripping her over a doll on the stairs, and it kills David by a gas leak. And even though the doctor had thought this was all stress-induced, he finds out that the baby is in fact homicidal, and the story ends with a showdown. Although I'm not certain what Bradbury's motivation was behind this story, the concept was absolutely haunting. And while infant horror can be a slippery slope because it can either become too cheesy or too political, Bradbury does a superb job in presenting an intense story without preaching. So I really admired the fact that he was able to tackle a subject in this light. Also, I really loved how we don't have a true origin on the baby. However, there is a speculation, but that really doesn't give us a solid answer. Because on one hand, if this is your typical baby, then that means all of the mothers who died during childbirth was because their newborn was rebelling against them for giving birth. But on the other hand, if the baby is actually the Antichrist, like what it's alluded to when David wants to name it Lucifer, then we have a whole other catastrophe just waiting to explode. And if the latter is true, then Amy and we were talking about how this would be a perfect story to set alongside with Rosemary's Baby or The Omen. Also, Hanny noted that until the doctor saw the abnormalities in the baby, she really thought that the fears that Alice and David were experiencing were psychological. And for a while I did too. But this story gets to a point where both of us decided that, yeah, this is not psychological. This baby is truly evil. So that was really cool to see how it all played out and how it all just kept the reader guessing until the end. And then, of course, we're presented with that open ending once again, where it's the showdown between the doctor and the baby. And we really don't know who came out on top, because even though the doctor has this scalpel, that baby is a badass. So, yeah, that's a lot of fun. Next up is the story called The Scythe. Now, this is about a guy named Drew and his family who have run out of gas next to a wheat field. And after they go to a nearby home for help, they find that the homeowner has died with a stalk of wheat in his hands, and next to him is a scythe. Also, they discover a letter that the homeowner left that explains whoever comes to his bedside has now inherited the farm, the scythe, and the wheat field. Well, since Drew and his family are poverty-stricken, they take their inheritance and bury the homeowner on a hill out back. But when Drew goes to harvest the field with the scythe, he discovers every time he cuts wheat, that wheat quickly rots, and wherever it falls, more wheat grows in its place. Which, because of this happening over time, the wheat field is 3 miles long and it doesn't stop growing. Then, after Drew becomes obsessed with trying to harvest the field, he learns that every stalk of wheat is tied to a human being. And whenever he cuts a stalk of wheat, the person who is tethered to that stalk dies. Personally, I felt like this was a very effective cautionary tale, and I loved how Bradbury breathed new life into the warning of, if you receive a gift, make sure there's no catch tied to that gift, because you could end up getting trapped, which I think we can all relate to some degree. Not to mention, I've always been a sucker for stories like this, where a curse is disguised as a blessing. Also, I felt like it was absolutely brilliant how Bradbury connected stalks of wheat to human souls, because while we have some stalks of wheat that have been cut which result in the death of people, we do have where new stalks of wheat are growing, which indicates to me that there's new life. So I really appreciated how Bradbury portrayed life and death, and maybe even the possibility of reincarnation. Aside from that, I was really happy to see how Bradbury covered all of his bases, because as I was reading, I started to question what would happen if Drew simply refused to cut the wheat. And before the story ended, it revealed that if Drew didn't fulfill his task, then people would still die, but they would be trapped in this state between life and death. And because of them being in this locked type of limbo coma, Drew realized that he had to continue cutting the wheat so they could go on and pass on. And that was something that I was really just blown away by, because you have where Drew doesn't want to do this, he does not want this obligation, and he thinks he's just going to pull a fast one and rebel, but no, he has to continue doing this so there can be a natural order to things. Now, even though I had listed these 3 stories as being my favorites, by no means are these like my top 3, because there were quite a few stories in this book that I would consider to be just as good as these 3. As a matter of fact, I'm about to use this next segment to speak about another favorite story of mine. I would like to take this opportunity to bitch about the assholes in the story called The Jar. Now, let me paint a picture. This story is about a poor lonely man named Charlie who has purchased from a carnival sideshow a jar that might have a human fetus in it. Which he does this because he's hoping it will be a conversation piece and it will gain him visitors. Well, as Charlie starts to gain the attention that he's wanted, it's alluded to that his bully of a wife, Theedy, has cuckolded him with a jackass named Tom. And for no other reason than to be 2 cold splats of diarrhea, Theedy and Tom find out what's inside the jar. Then, against Charlie's wishes, Theedy reveals to him that the jar is full of nothing but garbage, and she can't wait to tell everyone that Charlie is nothing but a big fool. So, because of bitch-face McGee here taking things one step too far, Charlie loses his shit and starts walking towards her with the jar while saying, "Here, kitty, kitty, kitty." Then we cut away from that scene, and Charlie is telling the townspeople that Theedy has gone off to visit some relatives that are far away, which we all know what that means. But because of a side story that we had gained about someone drowning kittens that they didn't want, the ending of this alludes that Charlie killed Theedy's trifling ass and replaced what was in the jar with Tom's love child. Now, as you can tell, Theedy and Tom were two absolute pieces of trash. Like, Charlie was just trying to live his best life, and they were openly screwing around, they were mocking him, and they made him the laughing stock of the town. And the thing about bullies is, they don't consider that everybody has a limit, and one day their ass might end up on a platter. And while I don't blame Charlie for what he did, my only one complaint is that while he was going batshit crazy, he should have also cut off Tom's balls and added them to the jar for a little extra pizzazz. The October Country by Ray Bradbury was a fun and morbid collection that primarily focused on the various ways of death. And among its 19 Gothic tales, 9 of those were absolutely amazing, 6 were good, 1 was okay, and 3 just weren't my cup of tea. But among my top 5 favorite, I would have to include The Emissary, The Scythe, The Small Assassin, The Jar, and The Wind. Now, as many of you know, I like to blindly go into my reads. And because of the title of this collection, I assumed it was going to be stories that were October or autumn based, but that wasn't the case whatsoever, as there were stories that took place throughout the year. But I do understand why this book was called The October Country, because the stories fall into the categories of being morbid or gothic. And even still, out of all of the stories that were in this book, there were only 2 that I felt were really out of place because they were too whimsical for a collection this dark. Character-wise, for the majority of it, I quickly became concerned for the well-being of the protagonist. And this is mostly because Bradbury is awesome when it comes down to creating strong characters in a small amount of time. Which some of my favorite characters were in the story The Jar, because the antagonist got under my skin so greatly, and everything about this felt like a time bomb, which was very similar to how I felt about the story called The Dwarf, except I felt like I was able to sympathize a little bit more with the underdog in that story. But out of all of the characters in this collection, I feel like I connected the most with the protagonist Charlie from the story The Emissary, which this is because he really didn't have any friends, and at that age, I didn't have any friends either, so his circumstance was relatable in that regards. Also, I truly felt sorry for the poor kid because he could never go anywhere or do anything, and it felt like he just kept losing things in life that meant something to him. So, yeah, that was tugging at my heartstrings a lot, and because of how I interpreted the ending, I truly felt dread, and I prayed that I had misinterpreted everything and that he actually had a happy ending. So, because of how that story haunted me and I related to that character, that was a story that I feel will always be very close to my heart. Theme-wise, as I mentioned, this book focuses on the variations of death. And aside from death being seen as a frightening subject, there are installments where the concept becomes humorous, like what we see in the story There Was an Old Woman. And in one circumstance, it's seen in a romanticized Shakespearean light with the story called The Cistern. Also, I even believe that it can be seen in a positive light due to how a reunion comes together in the story called The Homecoming. which, because of the diversity presented here, it was really interesting to see how many different ways death could go within one collection. Next up, I noticed where there was a reoccurring theme of domestic disputes, which this is mostly seen by disgruntled couples and overbearing parents. Not to mention, there's even one story where the horror is instigated by a newborn. But good examples of this subject can be seen in stories like The Jar, The Small Assassin, Jack in the Box, Next in Line, and even the possible ending of Touched by Fire. Also, I noticed where there was a small pull in stories like The Scythe and Uncle Enar. And in my opinion, this doesn't really become a tired or old subject because Bradbury is able to show us a wide spectrum of how this goes from mild to homicidal. Next up, it's obvious to say that all of these stories focus on loss and vulnerability, so I'm really not going to go into a deep discussion on that. But for the stories that regard a carnival, there's a vibe that suggests that the carnival is this mixing pot of good and evil. And since the carnival is normally seen as a fun event, I really love the juxtaposition on how the carnival can also be a breeding ground for negativity. Other than themes, I noticed where quite a few of these stories presented thought-provoking allegories. Like, for example, in the story called The Jar, we're presented with a scenario where someone purchases a mysterious jar from a carnival sideshow. And upon it gathering visitors, everyone has a different interpretation of what the contents of that jar actually is. Which, upon doing research, I discovered that this particular story represented Bradbury's belief that we embody the capability of being good or evil. Also, I really thought it was cool how in the eye of the beholder, a person or an object could both be praised and feared. Then, in the story called The Scythe, which is about a poverty-stricken family who inherits a field of wheat that might be more than what they bargained for, we receive a biblical allegory of the Grim Reaper. And as the Reaper fulfills his duties, we're presented with deaths as well as what could possibly be births. Which, as this unfolds, we see where it trails off into the themes of the cycle of life, and perhaps for some, even reincarnation. Overall, the October Country had quite a few creepy and unsettling stories. And while there wasn't anything in this book that I would consider to be grotesque, there were quite a few times where it felt like my skin was going to crawl off my bones. And actually, there was one story that did scare the ever-loving living hell out of me, but the more I think about it, the more I think that the ending was intended to be a happy one, but that still doesn't stop it from scaring the hell out of me. The October Country by Ray Bradbury was a fun and creepy collection where one of its greatest elements is how each story feels openly written so the reader can use their imagination. Which, in my opinion, the imagination can be more frightening than what's on page. So, if you're in the mood for an unsettling collection that is very thought-provoking, then I do highly recommend The October Country. And even though a great deal of the stories don't take place in autumn or October, this does feel like it is suitable for the season. Well, now that we're at the end of this episode, I would like to thank these amazing people for contributing to my Patreon account. As you can tell, some of the names listed here are creators, so be sure to check out their work. And if you would like to contribute to my Patreon account, all you have to do is go to the description section of this episode, and you'll see that I have a link available where for $5 a month, I'll give you a shout out like what you see here at the end of my videos, and if there is a certain profession you would like for me to tie to your name, just let me know. Also, I do have a $10 tier available where you'll still receive this shout out, but I do creepy photography on the side, so at the beginning of every month, I'll send you over one of my creepy photos, and from there, you can print it off, do whatever you like. If you're able to do this, that's awesome. If not, no sweat. I just hope you return to this channel so we can have a good time together. Also, if you would like to hunt me down on social media, links to my Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok are all available in the description section of this episode. And if you would like to spoil me, I do have a link to my Amazon wish list as well. And if you have yet to subscribe to this channel, be sure to subscribe and click that notifications bell because I have more book reviews coming in the near future. So until we see each other again, I hope you have a great week and sweet nightmares.